Hey guys, welcome to my Brago King Eternal Commander deck tech. Today we're going to be talking about my favorite Azorius commander. Brago King Eternal basically wants to blink or flicker things. If you're not familiar with what that means, it means that you momentarily exile them and immediately return them to the battlefield. This is going to let us accumulate lots of value. Let's get introduced to our commander. Brago is a 2/4 legendary spirit that costs 2 colorless, a white, and a blue. He has flying and reads, whenever Brago King Eternal deals combat damage to a player, exile any number of target non-land permanents you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. This is an amazing triggered ability. Basically what we're going to be able to do is momentarily exile any of our artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and even planeswalkers. By putting everything back into play, they have no memory of what they formerly were on the battlefield, which resets everything. So our planeswalkers will start with full loyalty all over again, and our enchantments can reattach to different targets. We can also take advantage of excessive enter the battlefield triggers by reusing the same creatures to generate extra value. With all the value you can generate through blinking cards with Brago, you're going to find yourself saying to your opponents,
"You have no power here."
So let's get into our deck tech. First, we're going to talk about mana ramp. Mana ramp is very important to every deck, and unfortunately we're not running green, which means we don't have all those cultivate and ramp spells. We're going to be running as many rocks as we can, and we want them to have the lowest CMC that they can possibly have. We're going to be running Felwar Stone, Thought Vessel, Azorius Signet, Arcane Signet, and Mox Opal. The reason why we're running these is because they're going to offer us the ability to get colored mana when all of our stacks pieces are in play, but we'll get to stacks in a little bit. Next, we're going to talk about mana ramp that produces extra mana. That's right, all of these rocks are going to produce 2 or more mana. We're going to start off with Soul Ring, Basalt Monolith, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, and Grim Monolith. The best part about using these is cards like Basalt Monolith, Mana Vault, and Grim Monolith require you to invest mana at a later time to untap them, but when Brago deals combat damage and we flicker them, they leave the battlefield, lose memory of their previous state, and re-enter, reset. We never have to pay the investment to untap them. Lastly, I want to talk about 2 more cards, Smothering Tide and Cloud of Fairies. Smothering Tide is so good. It's actually becoming a white staple. It's so powerful, and you should run it in just about every deck you have that runs white. What this does is whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2 colorless. If they don't pay the 2 colors, you get to create a colorless treasure artifact token that reads, tap and sacrifice to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. This is so good because as we're playing our stacks package, we're going to want to be able to get as much mana to circumnavigate our own tactics. We're going to be able to generate mana just by our opponents drawing cards. Next, there's Cloud of Fairies, and Cloud of Fairies is a card with an ETB that we get to abuse over and over again. Because our stacks is going to prevent us from untapping lands, being able to blink Cloud of Fairies and untap 2 mana is so good. We can untap specific lands that will give us the color that we need to continue plowing through our own stacks. With that being said, let's move on to stacks. So, you can't have a stacks package without having the orbs. Let's start with Winter Orb. Winter Orb is a 2-drop artifact that prevents players from untapping more than 1 land during each of their untap phases. Static Orb is a 3-drop artifact which will not allow players to untap more than 2 permanents during each of their untap phases. And we're going to run Tangle Wire, a 3-drop artifact that's got Fading 4. The way this artifact works is it comes into play with 4 counters on it, and at the beginning of our upkeep, we remove a counter from it. If we can't remove a counter, we must sacrifice it. Now that we've addressed what fading is, let's see what Tangle Wire actually does. It reads, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player taps an untapped artifact, creature, or land he or she controls for each counter on Tangle Wire. Notice that this takes place during our upkeep, which is after the untap phase. So if one of the orbs is in play, Tangle Wire comes in after that and forces them to tap things that weren't already tapped. It's basically resource denial, and it's really strong. We get to circumnavigate this a little bit. See, during our upkeep, we remove a counter, and by doing so, it drops it down to 3. Then we can tap itself to satisfy its own requirements and 1 other permanent. which means our opponents tap 4 permanents, but we only tap 2, one of them being Kangawire, which isn't really going to hinder us at all. Keep in mind, when Brago deals combat damage, we get to flicker our Kangawire. That means when it re-enters the battlefield, it's going to reset the counters back to 4 again. You can't play a stacks deck without imposing taxes on our opponents, so we're going to start off with Grand Arbiter Augustine IV. For 2 colorless, a white and a blue, we get a 2/3 legendary human advisor. He's going to give us a discount of 1 generic on both our white and blue spells, while simultaneously causing our opponents to have to pay an additional generic for every spell they cast. Next, we're going to move on to a 2-drop artifact called Thorn of Amethyst. This artifact causes non-creature spells to cost 1 generic more to play. This is going to be backbreaking for our opponents with all of our other stacks combined. Our last tax spell is Aura of Silence. It is a 3-drop enchantment for 2 white and 1 colorless that reads all artifacts and enchantments our opponents cast cost 2 additional generic to play. Additionally, at any time in the future, we can sacrifice Aura of Silence to destroy an artifact or enchantment one of our opponents controls. To tie up our stocks package, we're going to include Grand Abolisher, Aven Mind Sensor, and Cursed Totem. Grand Abolisher is a 2/2 human clerk for 2 white that will prevent our opponents from activating abilities and casting spells during our turn. Aven is a 2/1 flying bird wizard with flash that costs 2 generic and 1 white. He's going to prevent our opponents from casting tutors and cracking fetches. Lastly, we have a 2-drop artifact that prevents all players from activating creature abilities. And that brings us to card draw. You can't mention card draw in blue without talking about Rhystic Study. This 3-drop enchantment for 2 colorless and a blue states that whenever an opponent plays a spell, we get to draw a card if they don't pay an additional 1. Next up is a 2-drop enchantment with flash. For 1 and a blue, when Omen of the Sea enters the battlefield, scry 2, then draw a card. Now remember, every time Brago blinks this, we're going to get the scry 2 before we draw. That's not only card advantage, but it's card selection. That brings us to Watcher for Tomorrow. He's a 2/1 human wizard for 1 and a blue that enters the battlefield with Hideaway. Hideaway is going to let us look at the top 4 cards of our library, exile one of them face down, and then put the rest in the bottom of our library. When Watch for Tomorrow leaves the battlefield, put the exile card into your hand. So this card is going to give us card selection by looking 4 deep before we choose one to exile. Then, whether Brago blanks it or it's removed by one of our opponents, we're going to get to put that card into our hand. Again, it's card selection and card advantage. Our final card draw is a 3-drop aura. Curator's Ward reads, Enchanted Permanent has hexproof. When Enchanted Permanent leaves the battlefield, if it was historic, draw 2 cards. If you're not familiar with the term historic, it basically means if it's an artifact, a legendary, or a saga card. Since Brago is allowed to be our commander, that means he's legendary. When Brago's blink trigger goes on the stack, we get to target Curator's Ward and Brago. When Brago leaves the battlefield, that's going to let us draw 2 cards. Then, they both re-enter the battlefield simultaneously. When both cards re-enter the battlefield, Curator's Ward will enchant Brago. And that concludes card draw. Let's move on to tutors. Our first set of tutors are going to be spell-based. We're going to run Enlighten Tutor, Fabricate, and Reshape, all to search for artifacts. Then we're going to run Muddle the Mixture. Technically, Muddle the Mixture is a counterspell, but it doubles as a tutor if you play 1 and 2 blue to transmute it. That's going to let us discard this to search our library for another card with converted mana cost equal to 2. Next up, we have 3 2/2 human wizards. Each one costs 2 generic and 1 blue. Trinket Mage is going to allow us to search for an artifact with converted mana cost 1 or less. This is going to give us access to 4 of our mana rocks and our Sensei's Divining Top. When Tribute Mage enters the battlefield, it's going to allow us to search our library for an artifact with converted mana cost equal to 2. Tribute Mage is going to give us access to most of our rocks, a few of our stacks cards, and our win con. When Trophy Mage enters the battlefield, it's going to allow us to search our library for an artifact with converted mana cost equal to 3. Trophy Mage is going to allow us to search for most of our stacks cards, some of our evasion equipment, and a few mana rocks. Next up is Spellseeker, a 1/1 human wizard for 2 and a blue. When Spellseeker enters the battlefield, we may search our library for an instant or sorcery card with converted mana cost 2 or less. This is going to give us access to most of our counter magic, some of our spell-based tutors, and Cyclonic Rift. To round off our ETB tutors is Recruiter of the Guard, a 1/1 human soldier for 2 and a white. Unlike our other creatures that tutored artifacts, Recruiter of the Guard is going to tutor up creatures with toughness 2 or less. This is going to allow us to tutor up any of the creatures we've previously just mentioned, plus most of our win cons. Now remember, on combat, whenever Brago blinks these creatures, we're going to get to tutor all over again. We can get as many as 2 or 3 tutors a turn. Our last tutor is actually a Planeswalker. Tezzeret the Seeker enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty counters for 3 generic and 2 blue. We can add a loyalty counter to untap 2 target artifacts. We can remove X loyalty counters to search our library for an artifact card with converted mana cost X or less and put it directly onto the battlefield. Or we can -5 to have all of our artifacts become 5/5 artifact creatures until end of turn. The idea here is to remove counters without killing him on our main phase. After Brago deals combat damage and we can flicker it, we're then going to reset the counters back to 4, providing us a second tutor in the same turn that's going to put the target directly into play. Our next category is evasion. The only way to circumnavigate our own stacks is to ensure that Brago deals combat damage. We need him to stick to the battlefield. We're going to be running a couple of equipment cards, which we can tutor up with some of our previous mentioned mages. First up, Lightning Greaves, a 2-drop artifact equipment with an equip cost of 0. This is going to give Brago Shroud. Now remember, Shroud is going to give Brago protection from all spells and abilities. This includes our own. Unfortunately, that means we won't be able to blink him and give him pseudo-vigilance when he deals combat damage. Now even though Brago has built-in evasion with flying, that's not necessarily going to guarantee that we get through on combat. So we need a couple of ways to ensure that Brago gets through. So we're going to run Rispasil Cloak, a 3-drop artifact equipment. With an equip cost of 2, this is also going to grant Brago Shroud, in addition to making him unblockable. This is going to guarantee we deal combat damage and get our blink triggers on every combat. This brings us to our second Planeswalker of the deck. For 3 generic, a white and a blue, Venser the Sojourner enters the battlefield with 3 loyalty. By adding 2 loyalty counters, we can exile target permanent we own, return it to the battlefield under our control at the beginning of the next end step. This is going to allow us to stack blink triggers with Brago. We can remove a loyalty counter to give our creatures unblockable this turn. This is another way to ensure that Brago deals combat damage. If we remove 8 loyalty counters, we're going to get an emblem which reads, whenever you cast a spell, exile target permanent. Once we get an emblem, there's no way for other players to interact with them at this time. Once we get it, we'll always have it. The most optimal way to abuse Venser is to start off by removing 1 loyalty counter to give your creatures unblockable. This will ensure that Brago deals combat damage. When Brago deals combat damage and his blink trigger goes on the stack, we can target Venser. Venser will reset with 3 loyalty and give us a second opportunity to activate him during our second main phase. At this time, we're going to +2 to blink another one of our targets. If we flickered a target with Brago and re-flickered it with Venser, that's going to give us 2 enter the battlefield triggers on the same creature. Keep in mind, Venser's +2 loyalty ability can actually flicker any permanent, not just creatures. From time to time, you may not be able to deal combat damage with Brago. This means you're going to need other ways to flicker your cards. Our next category is extra blink spells. We're going to be running 3 instant spells. First up, Ghostly Flicker. For only 2 and a blue, we get to exile any combination of 2 target artifacts, creatures, or lands we control. This is versatility in allowing us to target permanents other than our creatures. Our next instant has a CMC of 1 white. Ephemera is going to let us flicker 1 creature. However, it's got Rebound. Rebound is going to give us the opportunity to cast this for a second time during our next upkeep for free if we originally cast it from our hand. Last up, Eerie Interlude. For only 2 and a white, we can exile any number of target creatures we control. However, unlike our other spells, the creatures won't return immediately. We must wait until the end of the turn for them to return to the battlefield. Yes, this is great for extra ETB triggers, but it also doubles as board wipe protection. Our last 2 flickers are going to be creature based. Our first creature is Charming Prince, a 2/2 human noble for 1 and a white. When Charming Prince enters the battlefield, we get to choose 1 of 3 abilities. We can either scry 2, gain 3 life, or blink another target creature we own until the beginning of the next end step when it returns to the battlefield under our control. Charming Prince is great to get back creatures stolen from us since he targets one that we own, not necessarily control. Charming Prince also lets us double up on the same ETB in 1 turn. When Brago deals combat damage, we get to target Charming Prince among other targets. When all the targets re-enter the battlefield, they each put a trigger onto the stack. Because they all see each other upon re-entry, Charming Prince can flicker one of those creatures an additional time. The Scry 2 is also good for card selection if we're digging for something specific. To conclude our extra blinks is a colorless 3/3 Eldrazi for 2 and a white. This creature has an activated ability for 2 generic and 1 colorless. Remember, the colorless has to be produced by a colorless source, such as our mana rocks or utility lands. We can't just tap 3 islands to pay for it. Once activated, we get to blink another creature and return it to play tapped. Eldrazi Displacer is probably the MVP of this deck. Let's take a closer look at the wording on the card. Note that it says another target creature, so we don't need to control it. It also states that the creature returns to the battlefield under its owner's control, allowing us another means to get our stolen creatures back. Keep in mind, it's an activated ability we don't tap to activate. This means we can abuse it multiple times if we have mana open from the rocks we blinked off Brago's attack. Now, Displacer is intended to abuse our ETB win cons, but it also doubles to deal with our opponents attacking creatures during combat. If an opponent has an attack trigger we don't want them to get, we can request our opponents notify us when their main phase 1 ends so that we can blink and tap down threats, preventing them from being declared as attackers. We can also wait to see if an attacking player attacks us or another opponent by allowing them to assign attackers, then blinking our targets. Remember, blinking an attacker will actually remove it from combat even though it's already been declared as attacking. Let's move on to Disruption. You can't have a disruption package without including counterspells. There are so many counterspells in the game, you're going to want to optimize these for your meta and your wallet. These are the few I currently run. First is the OG counterspell for only 2 blue. It's a cheap CMC spell that gets to the point. Secondly, I run Mana Drain, another 2 blue CMC counterspell, but additionally provides us ramp at the beginning of our next main phase. Something to note about the next main phase clause is if we cast Mana Drain during or before combat on our turn, the next main phase we get will be our second main phase that turn. Then we run Force of Will for 3 blue, though we never cast it for its 5 CMC. Counterspell has an alternative casting cost that's paid by paying 1 life and exiling a blue card from our hand. Our next counterspell is Dovin's Veto. For a white and a blue, we get an uncounterable counterspell that only targets non-creature spells. This is great for protecting our combo pieces from our opponent's interactions. Our last counterspell is a pseudo counterspell. For 2 blue, Narset's Reversal will copy target instant or sorcery spell, then return it to its owner's hand, and allow us to choose new targets for our copy. It essentially counters the spell if the player doesn't have mana to cast it a second time, but it also provides us with an opportunity to circumnavigate our opponent's counterspells, or simply double up on one of our own spells. If we target our own spell on the stack, Narset's Reversal will become a copy of the spell and return the original spell to our hand to be played again at a later time. Let's say an opponent was attempting to interact with our original spell. It won't work. For example, let's say we were attempting to cast Silence during our upkeep to prevent our opponents from interacting on our turn. One of our opponents cast their own Dovin's Veto, targeting our Silence. Dovin's Veto can't be countered, but if we cast Narset's Reversal targeting our own Silence, and there's no more responses when the stack resolves, Narset's Reversal resolves first, it casts a copy of Silence, and returns the card Silence to our hand. Then, Dovin's Veto goes to resolve, and there's no legal target anymore. We managed to circumnavigate the can't be countered clause of Dovin's Veto by not technically countering it. Not only that, but Silence the card is back in our hand to be cast again later that game. Which brings us to our next spell, Silence. With a CMC of 1 white, Silence is an instant that prevents our opponents from casting spells this turn. Usually on turns we want to combo off or at least get a win con on the table, we will cast this during our upkeep. This will turn off any interaction from our opponents they need to cast. We can also cast this during an opponent's upkeep who is set up to combo off as well. Silence won't shut down activated abilities though. so be aware of potential activations our opponents possess. We also run Swords to Plowshares. This allows us to exile annoyances for just 1 white mana with the trade-off of them gaining life equal to the target creature's power. Sending a commander to the command zone will increase the commander tax, which will work well with our stacks pieces. I've opted for Swords to Plowshares over Path to Exile because we're really trying to deny our opponent's resources. The only board wipe in the deck is a 2 CMC Cyclonic Rift. No, it usually doesn't cost 2 mana to cast because we're going to overload it for 6 and a blue most of the time. Rift is extremely versatile because for 1 and a blue, we can return target non-land permanent we don't control to its owner's hand. This is excellent temporary spot removal in dire times. Or, if we pay 6 and a blue, we can overload the spell and return each non-land permanent we don't control to owner's hand, becoming mass board bounce at instant speed. Note the 2 CMC because that's the cost of the card. The 7 is an alternative cost. It's good to remember because we can tutor it up with our Spellseeker. Spellseeker will also get just about all of our counterspells too. With Disruption out of the way, let's move on to the win cons. We want cards that enter the battlefield and disrupt our opponent's boards that we can utilize multiple times in a turn. Brago is mean. Brago does not play fair. For 3 and a blue, Rishiden Footpad is a 2/2 human pirate that forces our opponents to pay a tax of 2 generic mana or sacrifice a permanent when it enters the battlefield. The Rishiden Brigade is a 3/2 human pirate with flying for 4 and a blue that forces our opponents to pay a tax of 3 generic mana or sacrifice a permanent when it enters the battlefield. These are 2 prime targets for our Ghostly Flicker, Ephemerate, Eerie Interlude, Charming Prince, and especially Eldrazi Displacer. Being able to flicker either of these cards 2 or 3 times in a turn is going to turn into mass removal. Note that they both say an opponent must sacrifice a permanent, not sacrifice a non-land permanent. If they run out of creatures and enchantments and so on, they now need to sacrifice their lands. This card is extremely taxing because it forces our opponents to leave mana open on their turns so they don't have to sacrifice the permanents they've just played. Getting these out early or flickering them a couple of times in a turn can quickly turn into a hard lock, forcing opponents to quit. For 3 colorless and 1 Phyrexian blue mana, we're going to get a 0/0 artifact creature shapeshifter named Phyrexian Metamorph. The Phyrexian blue mana can be played by paying 2 life, so it could cost as little as 3 generic to cast. Phyrexian Metamorph enters the battlefield as an artifact copy of any artifact or creature on the battlefield. Our intention is for the Phyrexian Metamorph to become a copy of one of the Rishiden pirates when we can't blink them, allowing us to keep the pressure on. Remember, when you flicker the Metamorph in another target, you can't copy that permanent upon re-entry, the way Charming Prince can blink a target entering with him. The Metamorph enters as a copy, so that means our selection must already be in play as he enters the battlefield. Also note it enters as a copy of any artifact or creature. It doesn't target getting around Hexproof and Shroud if we like one of our opponent's cards better. Considering Phyrexian Metamorph is an artifact creature with a toughness 2 or less, it can be tutored by our Recruiter of the Guard and several artifact tutors previously mentioned. Recruiter of the Guard can also snag our Footpad and the next 2 cards. Fencer Shaper Savant. For 2 blue, this 2/2 legendary human wizard has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, will return target spell or permanent to its owner's hand. This card doubles for another counterspell that counters non-counterable spells. Just like Narset's Reversal, it removes the spell from the stack and puts it back into its owner's hand, not technically countering it, but not letting it resolve either. It doesn't have the same restrictions of only being allowed to target an instant or a sorcery as Narset's Reversal, so we can deny creatures, walkers, artifacts, and enchantments too. Additionally, we can bounce a permanent in play to its owner's hand. This includes our opponent's lands, or one of our permanents being targeted for removal. He's also an oppressive blank target when abused. We can set other players back a few land drops if we target their lands and possibly go infinite, bouncing our opponent's entire battlefields one target at a time. Also tutorable by Recruiter of the Guard is Soul Herder. For 1, a white, and a blue, this 3-drop 1/1 spirit has the ability to flicker another target creature we control at the end of our turn. He additionally gets a 1/1 counter whenever a creature is exiled from the battlefield. This card has built-in blink when Brago can't get through, while additionally becoming a beater. Let's say Brago deals combat damage and we flicker 3 other creatures in Brago. That's 4 1/1 counters this guy gets in combat, plus another 1/1 counter when he blinks a target at the end of the turn. This is all in addition to our normal ETB abuse. Needless to say, he's not one of our blink targets ever. He's just value sitting on the board until he becomes a huge one-shot threat. Additionally, Mace of the Valiant is a similar effect. For 2 generic and a white, this artifact equipment has an equip cost of 2. It gives the equipped creature vigilance while also putting a 1/1 counter on the equipment each time a creature enters the battlefield under our control. This means we can blink the creature it equips, then we can either re-equip it to the same creature or we can move it on to a better target. Our next creature is a little different. Unlike the rest of our creatures, this one has a leaves the battlefield trigger. For 3 and a blue, Nevermaker is a 2/3 flying elemental that can be evoked for the same cost. When Nevermaker leaves the battlefield, put target non-land permanent on top of its owner's library. It's not as oppressive as Venser Shaper Savant, but it's still a game-winning card. Worst case scenario, it can put target non-land card back on top of our opponent's library, which will prevent them from drawing into anything new and causes them to waste mana replaying the card again. It doesn't seem too bad since it's only 1 target at a time, but when it synergizes with our commander and our other blink abilities, it can lock players out. Now that we have the oppressive cards in play, let's go infinite. Stronic Resonator is a 2-drop artifact that has an activated ability for 2 generic and tapping it. By activating it, we get to copy target triggered ability. You see what's going on here? All we need to go infinite are mana rocks that collectively produce 2 or more mana, our commander, and one of the win cons just mentioned. So let's break this down. When Brago deals combat damage, his triggered ability goes onto the stack. With his blink trigger on the stack, we will copy it by activating Stronic Resonator. The copy of Brago's trigger will resolve first. Now we select our targets. Keep in mind they have to be a win con, the Resonator, and 2 mana from Mana Rocks. When they all re-enter the battlefield, our win con triggers. All of our rocks and the Stronic Resonator will enter untapped. We activate the Resonator again using the rocks we just flickered to copy Brago's original unresolved trigger. As you can see, we've just demonstrated a loop, and we're going to do this until our opponents have no boards, forcing a hard lock. It's mean, real mean. Most people scoop because they have nothing, in some cases not even lands, and we're going to be set up to do this again next turn. Let's move on to our value section now. This section is dedicated to cards that aren't necessary for the deck to operate, but enhance it when included. First up is Sensei's Divining Top, a 1-drop artifact with 2 activated abilities. By paying 1 mana, we activate the first ability and look at the top 3 cards of our library, then put them back in any order. It's a great ability that digs 3 deep. We can get spells and creatures we need to the top of our deck faster and smooth out our land drops. By tapping it, we activate the second ability, which allows us to draw a card, then put Sensei's Divining Top on top of our library. This ability primarily lets us draw our interaction we strategically put on top of our deck. In some occasions, it can protect itself from removal by being activated in response. Grasp of Fate is an enchantment that costs 1 white. When it enters the battlefield, we get to exile 1 non-land permanent from each of our opponents until it leaves the battlefield. In a usual 4-player pod, this enchantment will exile 3 targets. It's versatile because we can target enchantments, artifacts, and walkers in addition to creatures. If bigger threats become available, we can blink Grasp of Fate with Brago, which will return the previous exiled targets to play. When Grasp of Fate re-enters the battlefield, we target 3 new non-land permanents. We can retarget some of the targets we originally selected. Vesperlark is a 2/1 elemental with flying for 2 and a white that can be evoked for 1 and a white. Similar to Nevermaker, it also differs from the rest of our creatures because it has a leaves the battlefield trigger. When it leaves play, we get to return a creature with power 1 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. There's only 4 cards in our deck Vesperlark can retrieve, which are Recruiter of the Guard, Spellseeker, Soul Hoarder, and Phyrexian Metamorph. Normally, I wouldn't play a card that only synergizes with 4 other cards, but those 4 cards are strong in this deck, and being able to get them back by evoking Vesperlark for only 1 and a white is just too valuable. Likewise, our other grave recursion is Archaeomancer, a 1/2 human wizard for 2 blue that returns target instant or sorcery from our graveyard to our hand. Blinking her will lead to spell abuse. We get to return any of our disruption spells or cyclonic rift and the next card to be chained over and over again. For 3 blue, we get to take an extra turn by casting Time Warp. Unlike other extra turn spells, this one doesn't exile or shuffle in upon resolution. The goal here is to cast Time Warp when other players are stacked out or have little mana for interaction. That will leave us multiple turns in a row where we know no one can respond. Then we cast or flicker Archaeomancer before our turn ends to trigger the ETB and put Time Warp back into our hand. We will finish out our second main phase and pass the turn to ourselves. During our first main phase, we will recast Time Warp, then flicker Archaeomancer again to get Time Warp back to our hand. Without interaction, we have infinite turns. Most players scoop at this point, because you can kill players one at a time via commander damage, or draw into something more oppressive while playing it out. Basically, if you got this far and there's no interaction, players don't have interaction, or do, but don't have the mana to cast or activate it. Our next artifact is an essential value card. The deck works perfectly without it, but if we have it in play, it's pure accelerant. For 4 generic, Panharmonicon will trigger an artifact or creature entering the battlefield an additional time. Archaeomancer gets 2 spells back from the yard. Our pirates trigger twice. Our mages tutor twice. Watcher for Tomorrow will dig 4 deep to hide away 1 card, then dig another 4 deep to hide away a second card. That's digging 8 cards deep. When he leaves the battlefield, we put both of those cards into our hand. Panharmonicon is essential value in a blink deck. Lastly is a new card I recently discovered. Scroll of Fate is a 3-drop artifact that is activated by tapping it. When we activate it, we get to manifest any card in our hand. To manifest, we place a card from our hand face down as a 2/2 creature. If it's a creature card, we can turn that card face up at any time by paying its mana cost. But what makes this card so good in a Brago deck is we can manifest anything. See, when Brago blinks, we can target the manifest creatures. When they re-enter the battlefield, they enter face up. Essentially, we can cheat in mana rocks, planeswalkers, and basically anything that we can't afford to cast. This circumnavigates our stack spells. Timing it right, we can actually cheat in 2 cards per turn by activating it at the end of our last opponent's turn before ours, then untapping it during our untap step, and reactivating it before we move to combat. Brago will flicker both manifest cards and the scroll, setting us up to do it again next turn. Because Scroll of Fate has a CMC of 3, we can even tutor it with our Trophy Mage. Okay, let's move on to lands. So when it comes to lands, they're essentially up to you. It depends on how you want to play your deck and what you can afford. I'm not going to name every land, but we'll focus on some key elements and as to why I use them or provide helpful reminders. We're going to be running 33 lands with 9 basic islands and 6 basic plains. We have 7 lands that tap for either white or blue. I try to get lands that enter untapped if we meet another requirement. Of course, one of those lands is Command Tower. I also run Reflecting Pool, but be mindful in early turns. Reflecting Pool will only produce mana of a type we have other means of accessing. So if we have 2 plains in play, it will only provide us with white mana. But if we have multiple lands, or one land that produces multiple types, this will give us white and blue. Additionally, I run Adakar Waste. This card is good for the ability to produce colorless mana as it helps us activate Eldrazi Displacer. Ancient Tomb is ramp at 2 damage per activation. Homeward Path provides 1 colorless mana and can be activated by tapping it to allow each player to gain control of all creatures they own if someone stole ours. Academy Ruins also provides 1 colorless and provides an activated ability. By tapping it and paying 1 generic and a blue, we can put an artifact from our graveyard back on top of our library. Strip Mine provides 1 colorless mana and has an activated ability that by tapping it allows us to sacrifice itself and destroy target land. Rogue's Passage also provides colorless mana, with an activated ability that can make target creature unblockable this turn by tapping itself and paying 4 generic mana. This is good when Brago needs to break through enemy lines, but it targets, so make sure Brago's not equipped with Lightning Grease. Reliquary Tower grants us no maximum hand size and also provides 1 colorless mana. All of these lands provide utility while producing colorless mana to activate Eldrazi Displacer. Seed of Synod produces blue mana while satisfying Metalcraft for Mox Opal. Elmar Depths is the only land in our deck that has to enter the battlefield tap. It allows us to look at the top 3 cards of our library and put them back in any order when it enters the battlefield. I refuse to pay for fetch lands, so I run a poor man's fetch package. With Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expand, and Ash Barrens, as it has basic land cycling, which I can activate at the end of an opponent's turn before I begin mine if I need a specific land drop for that turn. Or if I need colorless mana for Eldrazi Displacer, I'll just play it. Well guys, that's it for my Brago King Eternal deck tech. I hope you enjoyed the video and possibly learned something new. Would you enjoy piloting this deck? Do you have a favorite commander you've been brewing for years? Thanks for checking out the video, and remember, always leave mana open for interaction.